Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. I have been told that we have Slido set up. So feel free to drop your questions into the Slido throughout the panel. I'll see them here on the screen, and we'll take some questions during, and then also leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. And you guys can let me know if you see some interesting questions pop up too. As mentioned, my name is Susan Su. I am head of growth and marketing at a company called Reforge. We are an early stage startup that does ed tech and professional training for mid-career folks at companies like Facebook, Google, Uber, et cetera, currently in the topic of growth. And prior to that, I was actually on our portfolio services team at 500 Startups, the growth portfolio services team, which is called the distro team. So it's quite related to our topic today. And I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about what each of them do at their firms.
Hi, I'm Choi. I'm a partner at Floodgate. I've been with the firm for about 5 years now. My background coming into venture was a little bit non-traditional in that I had spent time at a nonprofit tech startup in San Francisco, but prior to that, the majority of my career had been in investment banking, so primarily advising on mergers and acquisitions and some IPOs for tech and media companies. My day-to-day at Floodgate has definitely evolved over the 5 years that I've been with the firm. What I primarily focus on is I take board seats for companies that are past the 0 to 1 stage. So especially as they're getting ready to scale, create business development partnerships with larger corporates, and then any companies that are thinking about an exit, whether it's inbound, sell-side interest, or an IPO. I get very involved with the teams. And then we also try to develop a network of corporate contacts on behalf of our portfolio companies, and I often am the one taking the lead on that front.
So hi, I'm Jen Wolff. I work for Initialized Capital. It's a seed stage investing firm based here in San Francisco. My background's both sort of in the product design side of things. So originally worked for a lot of different design consultancies like Sapient. Then I moved more onto the startup side. So I became sort of head of product at a couple different later stage startups. And then most recently I was in New York as the head of product for a company called Reserve, which does restaurant hospitality technology. And then in the last year, I've been a partner at Initialized. I specialize in, like I said, product design advising for all of the startups. And then I also manage the rest of our operating team. So we also have advisors on engineering, PR, marketing, communications, growth, and brand part-time. So we kind of coordinate all those services and offer them to our portfolio companies on a pretty active basis.
Hey, everybody. Hello? That work? All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Casey Winters. I'm a growth advisor in residence at Greylock Partners. We are a firm that goes from basically A to growth here in the Valley. I help our portfolio companies with all sorts of growth challenges, primarily on the consumer side of the business. So everything from finding product market fit, figuring out how to scale acquisition strategies, improving your retention, things like that. Prior to Greylock, I led the growth team at Pinterest. I was there for 3 years. And before that, I was at Grubhub for 5.5 years, and I started the marketing team there. So a lot of kind of consumer networky marketplace experience that I try to bring to the portfolio as they scale.
So we have a pretty broad mix of types of roles, although this is all within the broader umbrella of portfolio services. Casey, your title is quite a mouthful. Growth advisor in residence, 4 words, growth advisor in residence. And then Jen and Iris are kind of more in a longer term capacity. Can you guys talk a little bit about the rotational quality of your role versus sort of like the long-term in-firm embedded roles for the two of you?
I guess I can start since I'm the weirdest. So as you think about like value-added services at a VC, there's usually 2 approaches. There's, bring on, people like you guys where you're dedicated value in specific areas on a permanent basis. And there are people like me where, I wrapped up my time at Pinterest and didn't really know what I wanted to do next. So I had the opportunity to kind of spend some time at a VC firm and work with a bunch of different companies, add some value, and then potentially go back into an operating role, hopefully at one of those companies. So when people are like, "Oh, are you joining VC?" and it's like, "No, I'm just passing through. I'm an operator." And I think the debate, which I'm sure you have had as well, is with some of these roles, there are certainly portfolios where they have a dedicated growth partner that's there permanently. And as I was discussing with Josh, Elman, who's kind of my sponsor at Greylock, it was, "Hey, do you want to get into venture long term?" And I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Well, great, because I think the growth role should be a rotational role. Therefore, the people that are coming in, every year and a half, are bringing kind of fresh skills and don't get stale." So I think the idea between like a kind of a gap year role like mine versus a permanent role is, can you design a role where if someone stays long term, they stay fresh with the skills, or the fear with kind of growth is, since it's so fast changing, is that if it doesn't kind of refresh with new blood coming in, then the person that's at the firm is increasingly out of touch with the latest growth strategies. And I don't know, I've had evolving thoughts on that as I've spent time at the firm. I'm sure you guys do too.
Yeah, I think Casey hit on a great point, which is there is that question of how do you keep your skills fresh? And I think one of the ways that we've tried to bridge that at Floodgate is one part of my role that I forgot to mention in my introduction is that I do help evaluate investments. So primarily one of the big points of distinction between myself and my other partners is that I'm not responsible for sourcing deals. But the reason why me actually helping with the evaluation of the investments is important is because I should be able to go out, especially in more of an external facing role, and represent our entire portfolio in a way that's very consistent with the rest of the partnership. And I think that for the freshness aspects, it's about maintaining the contacts that I have at companies and an understanding of what probably their roadmaps look like going forward, where they're looking for opportunities for inorganic growth. And so that's why it was also important that as part of my role, if I am an advisor when there are exit opportunities, that I am able to maintain the relationships with the people that we be calling to see if there's interest in potentially acquiring or partnering with one of our companies.
I don't know. Do we have to
Maybe Jen has a really good perspective on this. So
Yeah. Okay,
switching mics is worth
mics.
it.
So we actually use a combination of these strategies. So one, sort of in the area of growth, our growth partner's part-time. He actually works full-time at Google as the head of Google Assistant, and he was at Pinterest as well as a growth lead. So he's sort of combining some of that, real world experience with, advising companies that need sort of that help. We also have an in-house software product that we developed to help sort of track and manage all the companies. So I'm the product manager on that. The engineering partners are the builders of that. So we kind of have to build our own product pretty actively. And then I think at seed stage too, a lot of it is really, a lot of these people are very like first time founders, and a lot of the things we're advised on are not like how to build the most cutting edge UI that's ever existed. It is definitely more on how to create a roadmap, how to manage a team, how to hire the best people when you're first starting out, how to hire roles you've never had to hire for before, because maybe you've been a head of engineering at a sort of later stage startup, but how do you find that first designer, or how do you sell to that first marketing person that you really need on the team? So a lot of those challenges at the earlier stage are, sort of more the fundamentals, and so we try to combine those, I think, with, some people that are sort of still in the industry, along with, sort of us still having to do the job for ourselves, and kind of bringing those findings to the startups.
Okay, so we were talking about this a little bit at our table over here in the green room, but the concept of portfolio services is certainly not new, and it's been trendy for quite a few years now. It's to the point where it's hardly a unique differentiator for a firm anymore. But I think, and forgive me if this is like an obvious or rude question, but does it work, or is it an optics thing? And if it's an optics thing, does it work as an optics thing? So does it work for the companies, and then on the other side, does it actually work for the firm?
Do you want? Maybe I'll answer that one. We have the most services, so perhaps that. So I think there's two parts to this. So one, regardless of whether the services are I guess, making a major impact on the startups. We see them as a benefit because we work alongside the founders very closely. So we get much better insights into sort of how things are really going, who their work, how the team works. When it comes time to decide if we're going to, put more money in them or suggest them to other firms, we know a lot more about them than if we had just received sort of sporadic investor updates, via email over time. And also, we build that relationship with the founders so that when it comes time to raise again, if they're doing really well, they sort of know us really well, and they look to us first when when it comes time to kind of make that deal. Or in many cases, we're there to preempt. If it's a really good startup, we're sort of there. We know at the exact moment that we can kind of give them money at a better valuation than we get in a sort of a huge marketplace situation. So there's sort of benefits for us in terms of just kind of being there alongside them, on a really regular basis. So that's one side. I guess the other side, in terms of the services help, I think, especially at seed stage, it is very much when they need a lot of really fundamentals. So they don't know how to do a lot of really basic things, and so a lot of times we just focus on how can they really scale themselves, and here's some templates, here's some approaches, and a lot of times they can pick those up really well, and kind of we just assume that startups are hard and they're going to stumble around for quite a while at the seed stage, and so the more we can kind of stabilize that, the more quickly they can kind of accelerate themselves to find that product market fit or scale themselves really well. So that's sort of our perspective on it.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of those comments, that especially at the seed stage, what we often say is that in addition to being investors at a Floodgate, we like to consider ourselves co-conspirators with the founders. And one of our pitches to the founders is always, regardless of who leads the investment, you get the benefit of the team. And I think in some ways, having these additional services just is a way to communicate to the founders that you can call on us for whatever kind of help you need. And that sometimes the more formal and separate relationships that may happen at later stages is not what's happening when we invest in you. And so whether it's help with recruiting or an introduction to a potential economic buyer, that we want them to feel like they can come to us with any of those types of requests.
Well, and sorry to jump in here, but Iris, I think especially in your role, you're able to reach up into levels that the companies themselves would never be able to, specifically given your corp dev, the connections that you have with corp dev.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that we've really stressed upon over the last couple of years with my joining the firm, which is maintaining a network of contacts on behalf of our portfolio companies. And for us, the first stop oftentimes is the corp dev groups. And it's not because we're signaling that we're looking to sell our companies, but oftentimes with the larger tech companies, the way that they're organized, corp dev and strategy sit in one part of the organization, and they often have to partner up with the business unit. So rather than having a mandate of trying to meet every, for example, product lead within an organization, the corp dev groups often serve as their Sherpas within the company. And so whether it's getting into the app store, trying to get feedback about one of our conversational interfaces, whether they can help out with a customer service organization, our first call is often into the corp dev lead, who will then route us to the right person.
Yeah, I guess my perspective is a few things. So I think you were right in talking about there's a company side and then there's the VC side. And there's different ways it can work or not work depending on how both of those institutions think about the people involved. So with the company has to be willing to kind of, let people get into the guts of their company. So what I've noticed is that some founders are like, here's all it is. Here's everything that's there. It's very messy. Any way you can help is super great. And then some people are kind of very cagey about, letting investors know more about the truth of what's really going on, which is that startups are messy and they're hard and that there are things broken all the time. So sometimes the founders are just not very amenable to getting the value add that's possible, and sometimes they're completely open to it. And I tend to think those are the companies that outperform, are the ones that are open to the feedback and the help. And then on the VC side, I don't think you can necessarily just slap on value-added services to the firm, and then the firm otherwise just keeps operating like it was operating, and all of a sudden you get a bunch of value. Operating partners or people in transitional roles like me, in order to be able to help, they need to be plugged into how the firm operates, right? In terms of, you mentioned deal flow, you mentioned raising new rounds. If the traditional VC partners are not involving the operating partners into all of those decisions and all the things that are happening at those companies, then I think the operating roles will be more of a second-class citizen and add marginal value. If they take the time to actually build a process to make sure those people get involved, I think there's a tremendous amount of value, because like you said, most people are doing this for the first time. They just don't know the best practices, and they can save themselves years of heartache by just talking to the right person that's usually been there and done it a couple times before. But it's not something that you get immediately. I think the firm needs to adapt to having these people around, and the company needs to be open to be willing to let them see all the things that are going on.
Okay, on the firm side, aside from kind of sitting in on some of those deal meetings, aside from working with partners who own a certain part of the portfolio, what are some specific tactical things that a firm could do to better integrate their portfolio services?
So some of the things we do, the investing side definitely has a way that they look at all the metrics and how the companies are tracking, and they kind of prioritize them in a certain way to say okay, these ones we want to preempt, these ones we want to try to lead the round, these ones, okay, maybe we'll do the pro rata. We sort of cross-reference that with the operating side. So we say, okay, the ones at the top here, we want to kind of try to push more services on, both in terms of I think it's a little counterintuitive, but actually you want to put the services on the companies that are doing really well, because you can really accelerate them. I mean, there's, then there's sort of this middle area where you're okay, let's try to see if we can kind of push them up, and then anyone who's not doing well, it's sort of not ignore, but it's not gonna, there's no magic bullet down there that's gonna save them all, So some of that prioritization is very important to have in sync between the sort of the operating side in terms of limited resources, and then the investing side in terms of prioritization of the sort of the different companies in the portfolio. And then I think Iris, we actually the operating partners have a lot of different experience in areas that maybe the investing team has not had experience in, especially things like blockchain or machine learning. Some of those things, the engineering partners have a lot of experience in that the investing side is not, the sort of newer technologies, investing side is not as familiar with that. So we do have the operating partners also kind of help vet a lot of potential deals as well, and that kind of helps provide sort of shaping the portfolio early on to when they receive the services. It's kind of a more cohesive relationship. But then we also work very closely with the GPs on when they do the office hours and we're doing the office hours. That's what we sort of at Initialized use the software for, which is sort of creating one team that everybody knows what everybody said, everybody knows what the advice is. Let's kind of continually reinforce it. This is how we kind of make that one message, one team work in a collaborative way.
I do think that one of the important keys is making sure that the services partners are brought into the relationship as early as possible. Because what you want to avoid is by any means giving the signal that if the relationship lead is somehow transitioning away from the investing partner into someone else, that's intended to be a signal of either the firm's confidence in the business or potential, but rather that we are all critical members of the team. So one of the things that we do at Floodgate is after the check has cleared, we actually ask the team to come back in, the founding team, and have a meeting with us that we call open kimono. That's much more about, okay, now what's wrong with everything in the business? You have our money. We heard your pitch, but now tell us kind of what's the real story, because we're on your team now, and we're on your side. And then we actually go one by one to partner by partner to say, here's how I think I could help you. And again, it's consistent with the thesis being that when you take a check from Floodgate, it's not about one individual partner, but rather the benefit of the team.
And on the company side, so this is maybe speaking from my own personal experience at 500, sometimes I would find myself chasing companies, and I think that anybody that's been on the distro team at 500 knows what I'm talking about. So on this topic of accountability on the company side, in each of your firms, how do you close the loop on the value that you're adding? So for example, I imagine Iris, you put in a lot into building those relationships. You make an intro to help out one of the companies and then they don't follow up. Or Casey, you do all this work to kind of figure out the answer. Here's the strategy. I put it all together for you, and then they don't follow up. So what does that happen? Maybe that doesn't happen at Greylock.
Yeah, I think in general, what you're trying to figure out as an investor or as an operator potentially joining a company is how well the team executes, and what you said about trying to focus on the winners. A lot of that's not just because of like the venture returns. It's because those just are the teams that actually will do the things that you're talking about. There's a lot of companies where you talk to them and you talk to them again a month later, and they're like, oh, yeah, we did talk about that. I'm going to get to that. And then there are some companies where it's like a week later, they come back and they're like, okay, so I did that. Here's what I learned. I want to schedule a follow-up to talk about this. And it's like, okay, those are the companies I'm excited to spend more time with because I know we can learn stuff together. I know we can move the business forward. So I just rely on their feedback loop to decide like who I spend more time with. And then I have kind of my own, CRM where it's like, here's the companies in the portfolio the last time I talked to them, what we talked about. And I'm constantly checking that to see if there's someone I should follow up because they haven't done something they should, or maybe I haven't done something I should have done. And then if there's a couple times where I feel like I've put in the work and the reciprocation hasn't been there, then I'll just sort of back away from that business and focus on companies that it's a more fulfilling relationship.
Yeah, I think similarly, there's definitely a range of people who are, very responsive and ones that, you basically have to constantly nag as to, getting a response. I think, we just basically have sort of an escalating level of, like the original operating partner will try twice, then we'll try to get like another person kind of involved to help out. And then we might get to the sort of GP office hours level to sort of give them a little bit of a talking to. But, past that point, we do, if someone really doesn't want to accept help, we do focus on, a little more soft, advising. We're not, you have to do these things, otherwise we're gonna, you'll be in trouble. So, usually if they don't want to accept the help, we sort of have a little conversation with them about that, but kind of a direct manner, but we kind of put that on the GP side because they can be the bad cop, and then the sort of side can always be the good cop. But then after that we kind of back away, and usually they'll either come back and say like, oh, okay, well, I've been doing it on my own and it kind of sucks, and some of the things you said earlier were correct, and so now I'm back, or they will somehow figure it out on their own. They didn't do this in the first place, so that's great, from our perspective as well.
And even for us, I think part of your question was around, especially when it's based on our relationships and when we feel like they're not holding up their end of the deal. I think that one of the things that's helpful is that we as a partnership are just very clear with each other that the relationships that we bring are important across our portfolio and across our partnership. And so if there's someone where we're making the introductions and they don't follow through, that we can't make introductions on their behalf anymore, that we can't have the risk of damage to any of our relationships that could be better leveraged by the rest of the portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Okay, final question. So hiring a top-notch VP of growth or product or somebody to head up corp dev, M&A is hard enough when you're a superstar company. It's hard enough. So how do you build and staff out a portfolio services team as a VC? Whom do you look for? What is the timing profile and all the other nuances? How did Greylock find you?
Okay, I can talk about that. So essentially, I knew multiple partners at Greylock really well. I, worked with Sarah Towell when she was there. I knew Simon Rothman really well. I knew Josh Owen really well. So when I was thinking about moving on from Pinterest, I just talked to them and said like, hey, I'm thinking about moving on from Pinterest. Are there any interesting companies I should look at? And they said, no, actually, you should just come here and hang out with our companies and spend a little bit more time exploring a bunch of them and hopefully find one to join. So it came around organically just because I had relationships with Greylock and we're asking them for what are interesting companies in the portfolio to look at. So that's kind of my example, and I can talk about, kind of others if that makes sense. Yeah, so I think first off, when you're thinking about value add services, it has to come from what your customers are demanding, right? So when you think about what all the startups are asking for help on, the number one answer is pretty much always recruiting. So that's where value-added services of VC started, and then it came to like getting customers, so like go-to-market and growth, and then it's product. Getting enterprise introductions, getting help with M&A, stuff like that. So the smart VCs are just trying to go down the line and say, any request that I'm getting, multiple times, I should try to see if I can staff for that. And when your first answer is recruiting, you already have in-house recruiting people that know all the best people in those areas. So then when those people go to those people to think about their next opportunity, potentially those people talk to them about like, oh, is a longer term VC opportunity the right thing for you? Should you do a gap year like me where you hang out here and help our companies? So I'm seeing that a lot where it's actually coming in through the executive partner or the recruiting partner.
I think for us, one of the things that we look for is someone who's an all-around athlete, ideally with the ability to help evaluate deals, if not lead them, but that also has a superpower. And so when you think about our team, I'll just give one example, which is one of my partners is Ryan Walsh, who had led a product on the software side for Beats Music, had been acquired into Apple, where he led a product development for all the media side. And so he obviously has a very different superpower than the rest of the partnership. And so we think that's always very helpful, is when you feel like you're culturally aligned, but then in terms of skill set, there's something that you bring to the table that's very different than the rest of the team.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, the story I always tell our LPs is I was hired because Gary Tan, our managing partner, when he was in high school, he was an intern for me. So, 20 years later, he came and found me again. He worked for me 2 other times, before he went to Y Combinator. So, he's gone and found people that he's worked with over the years that he thinks are, sort of very excellent in one area, and that where we complement each other, sort of very differently in terms of like what we specialize in, but culturally, I think kind of are committed to working together as a team, and so that we're not kind of fighting each other on those points, but each have a different specialization where we can kind of try to combine those.
Cool. Well, that wraps it up. I don't think we have. Do we have audience questions? I didn't see any come up in the Slido. Oh, now they're all here. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so this is a nice question for Jen. You said you have developed an in-house software to manage internal affairs and portfolio requests. What does it look like? What are the features? I actually think this is a really good question.
Okay,
A lot of VCs try to build software and it doesn't always work very well.
Yeah, so our software does a variety of things. And actually, I had a meeting this morning with another firm's software team, and that they're a later stage, and their software was very different than ours because their software was all about bringing in data to source deals, and ours is much more about managing companies and workflow. So any contact anyone has with a company, it sort of gets logged in a very detailed way into our software. It's sort of a CRM component, but there's also a lot of automated task management. So when something goes to all partner, it automatically triggers sort of a blind voting process that the partners can use to say, I'm going to evaluate on these criteria. This is why. Sort of historically, we can look back on it. It also, triggers a lot of different sort of diligence tasks and things like that in terms of, or do these intros, or, we need to kind of make this list of VCs that we want to, kind of share this company with, or we want to see all the companies that we need to invite to this event, put them all together in this criteria. We also have an API that we connect with our portfolio companies where all their metrics can be directly piped into the software, so we can kind of see in real time, how they're doing. Next to sort of another tab, which is all our sort of investment details. So how we kind of see how the performance is versus what we've put into them. And then we just started doing some things around recruiting, which is sort of, pulling in all the jobs across all of the portfolio companies, doing a lot better matching of like who can be, instead of like having to go to everyone's website and be like, who's hiring now and what jobs, So trying to like facilitate that in the intro side of things as well on the recruiting side. So sort of everything from deal flow to portfolio management, that side of things, to kind of starting to expand out to tools that can help the portfolios themselves.
Cool, thank you. That's a lot of features.
Yes, we've been doing it for a year.
You have a big priorities roadmap.
Yes.
get
We have a
lot of
Trello
requests.
board that the GPs or anyone in the firm can sort of submit their requests, and then we go through a regular product management like prioritization process.
It's like, pretend I want a graph here.
Yes.
Okay, great. Do you charge startups for portfolio services as a deduction from the round raised, or are the services included?
No, we don't. Again, we feel like we get benefits in a bunch of different ways, a lot of which we covered. We get better insight into the companies. Ideally, the services we offer help our companies create more value than they might otherwise. So we definitely don't charge for them.
Yeah, we don't charge either. That's actually a point they're often confused about when we first meet with them. They say, "Is this free? Or do we have to pay you?" And it's like, no, it's completely free. You actually already paid us by allowing us to invest in you. You know, it's completely free.
Yeah, same. It's free.
Okay, if you just had if you're running a firm, you're starting your own firm, and you just had a small amount of money, what services would you prioritize? Finance, HR, M&A, recruiting.
So there's one that's not listed here that I think we've seen more smaller firms offer, where they may not hire a dedicated person in-house, but they'll pick up the tab, which is actually an executive coach. So it's less about the tactical and more about, especially if you're a single GP, you don't necessarily have other partners to lean on for advice. And so it's more about making sure that the founders themselves feel like they are getting enough support outside of just your own perspective.
I don't know if I have it like for one person. It might probably be in the recruiting side, because usually when they're starting, that's the hardest part. So if you have someone who can kind of accelerate a lot of those processes, most of them have not. They can work their personal network, but past that, they're it's very competitive, especially in the Bay Area. So I would say probably recruiting services are the main thing to sort of have the first help with.
Yeah, and I think as the firm grows, as Casey mentioned, that can actually pay dividends back to the firm's portfolio services too.
Yeah, I'd say if you're unsure, ask your customers, which are the companies you invest in, what they need the most help with.
Okay, last anonymous question. Is there such a thing as being too involved in the startup you're investing in, i.e. being an overbearing VC? What are the signs of being an overbearing VC?
Are some of our companies here?
Exactly. Did somebody ask specifically? I think one thing we try to be conscientious of, and it's less about the portfolio services, it's the sense of, are you becoming emotionally attached to the company and no longer being objective about whether or not you want to do the preemptive term sheet or do more than your pro rata. And that's where I feel like there is the benefit of having more than one partner to try to keep you honest.
Yeah, that's definitely how we kind of look at it as well. To sort of make any decisions, there's sort of a multi-partner aspect to it. So we've even had that conversation where some of these founders have been with with the managing partners for a very long time. From they went through YC, and it was like 5-6 years ago, and so they've been alongside them for a long time, and sort of it's on the other partners to say like, okay, we understand this is like someone you really care about, but we need to kind of still float above here with logic, in terms of like whether this is good for the returns for the for the fund, not just for helping founders.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly horror stories from the operating side of VCs trying to get too involved or overextend their knowledge. So that certainly happens. I think when you're in an operating role, it's their company, and you're just trying to provide value, and you're taking signal from the company if you can get more involved or less involved. So you should be trying to sense if you're there because they want you, or if you're there because you kind of forced your way in too much. I'd say I'm willing to force my way in a little bit to show the value that I can provide, because not a lot of people necessarily understand what growth is or what the hell it is I do. But once I've done that, then I rely on them to kind of say like, oh, I want you to come back in and do this, or no, I'm good for a while. Let's meet in a month. And I think if you're trying to be in every stand-up or whatever, they'll probably just tell you to get the F out eventually.
On that note, thank you all for being here.